I'm Susan, I'm the CEO for FAM, and it's wonderful to see so many people here this afternoon. I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we live, work and play. I'm talking to you on the land of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. I thank elders past, present and emerging for their custodianship and care of the lands and water for over thousands of years. We can't underestimate the power of conversation. When there is a change, we need to talk it through until we understand the what, why, and how it may affect us. It's an important role for FAMs to facilitate conversations on matters that are important to our sector, and exactly why we're here today. In March, DCJ informed the peaks and the sector about a new clause to be inserted into our contracts. FAMs asked the sector if they would like further information on that clause, and we had an overwhelming response of yes. And so we've invited DCJ today to have a conversation with us about that. We're going to talk about the intention behind the clause, how the clause benefits organisations, and clarify any concerns and ask questions. But just before we begin, just as a little bit of housekeeping for you, as we have so many people here today, we have tried to put everyone on mute unsuccessfully. So if you could just please ensure that you are on mute for now. You've introduced yourself in the chat box, which is great. But if we know you have some burning questions, please use the Q&A function in Teams. That will help us to consolidate all the questions into one place. We will then be able to answer as many questions as we can towards the end of the session. And if we don't, we will forward those questions on to DCJ to be able to give some clarification and a response. As Lisa said, the session is being recorded, so please ensure you turn your camera off if you don't want this to be on our website. I would now like to introduce Anthony Shannon, Director, Early Intervention, Volunteering and Youth from DCJ, to say a few words as we begin. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. College country, coming to you from Wongal country, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal colleagues today. So thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today, and thank you for FAMS for hosting this conversation. It's really good to be able to talk with you again. We find these opportunities where we engage with you around our programs, our early intervention programs, really useful and really helpful. It's really important to hear from you about all aspects of the kind of work that we're all kind of delivering. It only helps make our programs stronger and more effective. So thanks for the opportunity to talk with you. I'm with my colleague today, Felicity Lindsay. I'll get Felicity to introduce herself. Some of you will probably know Felicity.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me here today. I'm Felicity Lindsay, Manager of Early Intervention Programs and Implementation, and I'm coming to you from Darug, Gundungurra country, and I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners and also pay my respects to elders past, present, and also Aboriginal people in this meeting as well. Thanks, Anthony.
Okay, so today we just wanted to kind of have a bit of a conversation around some proposed changes that we're considering making to our targeted early intervention contracts. I'll talk a bit about the background around that and some of the context. Then Felicity will kind of run through a few slides with a bit more detail, and then as Susan mentioned, we're really happy to kind of hear any questions or any comments you might have. We're really interested in what you think about this clause. We want to kind of take this opportunity to hear any concerns and questions. So if you do have anything you're concerned about, please either put your hand up or enter it in the chat. And we're very interested in your feedback. So where this kind of came from, or the reason why this came about, is we've been doing, or DCJ across all its programs has been doing some work around its contract management framework, particularly looking at kind of variations to contracts and tightening up some of the internal processes around, and in contracts with providers around how contract variations are managed, and kind of tightening up that process, which means that a lot of you have been involved in varying DCJ, and you'll obviously understand the exchange of letters that occurs, the negotiation agreement around that, and the relevant authorised signatories signing the documents. So as you know, in our targeted early intervention program, we've really had a flexible approach to the way that services are delivered.
Did you get her? No.
In terms of the principles around, where circumstances change with clients and communities and which you're working, that you should be able to, also change the services you're delivered if that's what's required. So kind of hearing back from families and communities around kind of changing needs and being able to be responsive and flexible in your service delivery is an important principle of the TEI program. It's something that we've kind of had in place since the start of the program, and we talked a bit about through the reform phase, and we've really tried to kind of, I guess, give that flexibility more effort by supporting providers to, change contracts if circumstances in their communities change. And we've seen many, many examples of that over the last 3 years, where organisations have come to DCJ with suggestions around how they might change their service delivery, whether it be what they're delivering or, with whom they're delivering, or the certain or the model of service delivery. In all those instances, DCJ and providers at the district level have, talked through those changes, negotiated those changes together and agreed those changes. And then in lots of instances, those changes have been made, and then providers have continued, services. So where there's been like very minor changes, as you know, like to things like your target group or location or some of your outputs or even your service type, we've talked to you and districts have talked to you about negotiating and agreeing on those changes, and then just in many circumstances just exchanging emails to say that there's been a change to your contract because they're only minor. And that's been we've heard back from the sector that that's been a very effective and streamlined approach to minor changes without having to go through a formal contract variation, which requires more paperwork and more red tape. So that kind of flexibility has enabled reduction in red tape for providers, but also allowed us to continue with that flexibility. In some instances, providers have actually asked to have a formal contract and requested to kind of do that, and that's been perfectly fine. That's occurred in those instances. So this change that then DCJ has made to its contract variation process, now that in TEI we can no longer continue to agree with you and make those minor contract changes and then simply exchange emails. Now what's required is we have to undertake a formal contract variation for any change to contract, regardless of how minor that is. So given the kind of principles around the flexibility of TEI and our kind of efforts in kind of making sure those principles are, kind of embedded in the program, we did negotiate with our legal area to design a clause, which kind of what we've put forward to now, this amendment clause, which will allow us to continue to have that flexibility and continue for you to negotiate locally with your district, agree on those changes, and then simply exchange in writing by email, if that's the simplest way to do it, those minor changes in relation to service type, target group, or outputs, and then continue to deliver services. So that's really the intent behind this clause, this amendment clause. It's really meant to, I guess, kind of more formalise that kind of that streamlined process, which will hopefully reduce kind of the red tape around having to go through a more formal contract. You're also able to continue to do that contract variation if you wish to do so. However, I guess some of the challenges we've had with kind of the clause, and since we've released this clause, is our legal areas has given us very limited or actually no room to move in terms of the wording of the clause, which we understand and have heard back from some providers that kind of present some issues to organisations, agreeing to this clause or going forward with this clause in their contracts. And I think some of those concerns are valid. I mean, I think some of the language in the clause can be read in a certain way, which kind of unintended kind of outcomes, or potentially could include some unintended outcomes from the clause. The intent behind the clause is that always, in all circumstances, any changes to contracts, either using this clause or obviously through a contract variation, would need to be negotiated between the provider and DCJ, and also agreed, and that, you know, there's no intent at all in this clause for DCJ to unilaterally direct the provider to undertake certain activities or change their contract. And over the last 3 years of the program, as I mentioned, there's been many changes to contracts, and there's been no examples at all of DCJ directing an organisation to do something without, you know, a negotiation and agreement around that. So even though some of the language in the clause may kind of raise some concerns of providers around DCJ's kind of ability to direct providers to do things without negotiating agreement on that, that's certainly not the intent of the clause. However, we do acknowledge that can sit into the clause. So we're kind of, what we've done at the moment is there's a small number of contracts, around about 15%, I think, or a little bit under, which have either been extended from the 30th of June this year or in the process of being extended. And some of those contracts that had this clause included. We're really interested, I guess, we'll see how this clause goes over the next 12 months to see if it actually adds any value, if it works, if it is more of a streamlined process. And then we'll come back, and during that time, we're really interested, obviously, to hear more from you and to see whether we do want to either keep the clause or not keep the clause as we go into recommissioning, you know, in 2025, which is in 2 years' time. So we're not committed to including this clause definitely ongoing. We're kind of interested to see whether it kind of works and helps with some of that flexibility. It very well may not. And some of the other language in the clause as well may mean that some providers are very unwilling to include this clause in their contracts. And if that's the case, then you know, we certainly won't go forward with this clause into commissioning in 2025. So we are kind of interested in taking a bit of a kind of you know, try, test and learn phase with this. So that kind of really gives, I guess, a bit of the background. Yeah, I think production, that's kind of really the background. There may be some questions people have now. Very happy to kind of answer those, or we can kind of move on to Felicity's kind of slides, and then we can come back to questions. I can just share.
Thank you, Anthony. I think what we'll do is we'll just poll questions for the end of the conversation, and then we can consolidate it all. And that way, hopefully, maybe within the presentation, they may get the questions answered, so we can sort of, you know, have a smooth transition. So again, just to introduce myself properly, my name is Lisa Smiloff. I'm the Sector Engagement Officer at FAMS, and I'm very pleased to be in this space today to facilitate the conversation with DCJ in particular and with yourself, so you get the chance to maybe hear more about what the clauses are going to mean, whether, you know, as we've already discussed. So I'm going to hand now straight over to Felicity, who will take control of the screen, hopefully very smoothly, and talk to some more detail about the clause and where it's come from and how it's going to work. We'll come back to conversations after that. Questions.
Thanks, Lisa. Can you see my screen? Yep. Okay.
So smooth.
Wonderful. Look at us go. Look, thanks, Anthony, for that introduction. You almost said everything that's in my slide deck, but that's okay. Hopefully, me kind of restating some of the concepts and, you know, where this kind of came from, hearing it again in a different way might help to kind of clarify for people, you know, what's this all about? What are we trying to do here? So just to, as I said before, and lots of people have joined since I first introduced myself, so I'll just quickly do it again. So I'm Felicity Lindsay, Manager of Early Intervention Programs and Implementation within DCJ. So I look after the program management of the TEI program and FCS program and a couple of other little programs as well. Okay, so contract variations, contract amendments, what does this all mean and why are we talking about it now? So as Anthony said, you know, when we first set up the program and the way of contracting TEI, we always wanted to have really flexible contracts. We wanted to give longer term contracts, which we did in lots of cases, and the majority of cases 5-year contracts. But in providing those longer term contracts, we always wanted to have a way where we could respond to changing needs and adapt service delivery based on the new data that we were collecting and what we were hearing from the sector and that kind of thing. So what we've been able to do up until this point is, and this is like about minor changes, whenever little things have come along the way, we've been able to, as Anthony said, send emails between service providers and contract managers to say, okay, we've had a conversation, we've had a look at our data for the last 6 months, or we've updated our program logic, which is something that everyone's doing every year. And in our contract management meeting, we've had a conversation and we've realised that, you know, maybe the original service levels or client targets that we set when we first negotiated the contract, they weren't quite right. We didn't really have strong data back then to check whether those original service levels were correct. So now our data is telling us that it's probably not quite right. So we both had a contract management meeting and we agreed together, let's tweak. Let's change the service levels in the contract. That's just one example of where this clause is going to be useful. So, and let me just, sorry, I'll just move to the next slide. So basically we want to keep that flexibility that we've had before. Anthony mentioned that there's a new contract variation policy. So this is the why. Why are we talking about this now? So the change that's happened last year, a new contract variation policy came into place. And it just means that those email exchanges where we informally agreed to minor changes to contracts, we can't do that anymore. We're not allowed to do that anymore. And so the position that we found ourselves in was, well, if you want to make a small change to your contract, to your service levels, or maybe you want to add a new location to where you're delivering a parenting program or a supported play group, then every one of those minor changes has to come, your contract manager has to write a briefing note, they have to send it to us in the program area, we have to approve it, then you guys get a letter of variation and then you have to send that to your board or your authorised representatives, they have to approve it before it can actually be agreed. And so, you know, if it's a big change, if it's something significant and there are impacts on funding, then all of that is still going to be what happens. You will still use a contract variation. But what we're trying to ensure is that smaller changes like the one I described before, that you can still make those changes in a really smooth, quick way where it doesn't have to go through that whole administrative cycle. So at the moment, we can't do that email anymore, but we want to implement this new contract amendment clause so that we are able to what we call exercise an option, where we can have that contract meeting, we can agree together on that small change, and then DCJ sends you a letter, which is the option to exercise an option, and it just says, we agreed on this day that you're going to do this from now on. And then that's, you know, the new agreement. As Anthony said, this does not change, this does not remove the option for the contract variation policy. So we don't anticipate that you would ever receive one of these letters that says we're suddenly going to change something without you having had a conversation with DCJ about it beforehand. If that did happen, you could always go, well, I want to actually go through the contract variation process. I want the opportunity for my board to see this. I want them to have the chance to agree to this. So that is still part of the process. So I'm going to go in a second into like, when do we use a contract variation and when do we use this contract amendment clause? So that was the problem. I've talked about the solution being that what we would like to do, what we've already done this with all of our contracts that were expiring on the 30th of June. We've sent them a letter of variation and we've included this new clause into their contract. So the way to put this contract amendment clause into everyone's contracts would be to first vary your existing contract to include this new clause. That's the kind of process of how it becomes in place. But now I'll just talk to you about when we would use it and when we wouldn't use it. So this is the clause. I'll come back to that in a sec. I'll just quickly tell you when we'll use it, when we won't use it. So when the contract amendment clause is actually in place in your contract, if that's the path that we all agree to go down, then you'll be able to use it if there's a change to service types. Again, I guess the most important thing for you to note at this point is I'm not talking about a huge change in service types and we suddenly, sorry, I was just thinking about service levels then. I'll just talk about service levels or client numbers. So for client numbers, we wouldn't expect to say, oh, you've got to work with this huge number of clients that we didn't have in your original contract and that there would be an impact on your funding. If you expect any change proposed to have an impact on your funding, then that's not what this clause is for. The DCJ contract manager should be able to identify what might have an impact on funding or resourcing, I should say, and what wouldn't. And so they wouldn't even try to use this clause if they're expecting that this would have an impact on resourcing. But if they did, then, you know, that you would have the opportunity to say, well, this is really a contract variation. I'm not expecting that you guys would need to kind of make that distinction, but just to say the kinds of changes that we're talking about under the contract amendment clause to client numbers is that maybe we got it wrong when we first negotiated the contract and the numbers are not realistic, they're not feasible, and the data tells us that actually the numbers should be different and we all agree, and it's not significant. It's not a massive change. In terms of service types, within a program activity, so if you're funded for targeted support, for example, and you want to change the service types within a program activity, that's something you could do under the contract amendment clause. But you couldn't, on the other side, you couldn't change program activities. That has to be a proper contract variation. Geographic location could be changed under a contract amendment. But again, this is not like we want you to set up in a completely different location, set up a new building, you know, all of those kinds of changes have expenses involved. So we're not saying that you would use a contract amendment to completely change your contracted geographic location, but it might be that, you know, you were delivering youth programs within 5 local schools. Perhaps the data is telling you that one of those schools, you know, there's low engagement, for example, or there's interest in another school kind of being added to the places where you're delivering that youth program. So you might update the contract to say, okay, we're going to not work with that school anymore, we're going to work with this one instead. So it's kind of changes like that aren't going to have a big impact on, or any impact on your actual funding or resourcing. It's more of kind of even a swap of, you know, working here, now we're working over there kind of idea. You could change outcomes, so you could be contracted to deliver one outcome, but over the course of collecting the data, you're seeing that actually lots of families that come in are having great outcomes in a different space, and really that is actually the primary outcome that's being achieved when people come to your particular service. So that again could be a change. You could change the primary outcome that you want to achieve by the services that you're delivering, or the target group. You might both agree, the contract manager and the service might both agree that the target group has actually changed slightly and that you'd like to update the contract to better reflect that. So under the contract amendment process, this just is approved locally within the district. The way that we exercise this is send you a letter, which will probably be in an email format, which is the exercise and option. That's how we would actually do it. And the difference again to a contract variation is that your board, you guys don't have to sign it. DCJ sends it to you and basically says, you know, this is is something that we've negotiated on and agreed, and here's the record that shows that we agreed on this. So just to contrast that with contract variations, again, at any time, you guys can request a contract variation if any changes that DCJ is proposing, if you're not comfortable with it, or if you think it's going to have an impact on your resourcing, that kind of thing. Funded services can say, well, I would like this to actually be a formal contract variation because I'd like my board to actually see this and have oversight of this. So if you think that any changes would have an impact on funding, that would have to go through as a contract variation. If there are any changes to program activities, it would have to be contract variation, and any changes to milestones, whether that's the addition of new milestones or changes to dates, again, that's a contract variation. And so those contract variations have to come through to us in the program area to approve. And as I already said, it would need to go to your board or your authorised representatives for approval as well. So they're the key differences between contract amendments and contract variations. I'll just quickly go back to the clause. I'm assuming that most people have seen this, but I'll just quickly run through a couple of key points. As Anthony said, the wording, like it's legal. When we first saw the wording of this, we were like, oh, it's really like legal and sounds really kind of bossy. And, you know, it's not really the language that we're used to. But what we've put in the front end is to try and make it clear that, you know, it says the parties agree to meet regularly to review the delivery of services and to consider whether any amendment to the services, the delivery of services is required. That's us trying to make it clear that this is meant to be a conversation between your contract manager and you, and that you're talking regularly about your program logic and your data, and you're thinking about, you know, the contract that we have now, does that actually reflect what we need and what is actually happening? Do we need to change it? Do we need, when we updated our program logic, you know, we saw that the need had changed slightly, so can we change our target group? They're the kinds of conversations that we know that you're having. And so I see the trigger really for this amendment clause to be exercised would be, you've updated your program logic and you've noticed something has changed. You've, you know, submitted your data for the last 6 months, and then you've had a look back at the data and you've seen that something has changed, and you've had a contract meeting with your local commissioning and planning officer, and, you know, together you've seen something has changed. So the changes, you know, ultimately from a legal point of view, the changes, DCJ decides whether the change happens or not, but this is intending to tell you that you have a part to play and you can bring suggestions to DCJ about what should change in your contract based on what you've done in your program logic and what your data looks like, that kind of thing. And section B, that goes through what was in the last slide that I showed you about when, like what kinds of changes, so the actual service types you're delivering, the way they're described. And when I say the description of services, that's in your contract under table 2, there's a little section where, so you might be contract, your service type might be parenting programs, and underneath it may specify the actual parenting program you're delivering, where you're delivering it, who you're delivering it to, like some more meaty detail rather than just the name of the service type. This is just to say that you can change the wording underneath that table 2 in your contract using this clause as well. You can change which outcomes you're aiming to achieve, the target group, the location, and the quantity as well. We've seen a question about the minimum of 30 days and the interpretation of that, of us saying that you will only have 30 days to implement any changes that come out of exercising this clause. And just wanted to clarify that this is we have to give you a minimum of 30 days notice. It's not you have to do it by 30 days. It's like, we wouldn't expect any change to occur within the 30 days. And then, you know, you can negotiate with your contract manager any timeline. This doesn't kind of dictate what the timeline should be. It's just to say we have to give you at least 30 days notice, not that you have to change in 30 days. So I just wanted to clarify that because that came in as a question. And, you know, G there says the provider may request an amendment to service delivery. Again, that's us trying to communicate to you the intention that you can bring change to us as well. It does say that we may accept or reject the proposal, which, you know, it's kind of harsh sounding legalistic kind of language, but the first part of the sentence is really trying to capture our intention that you can bring change to us as well. It's not all just DCJ deciding that something may need to change. It's a two-way street in that sense. The funding for amendment, that's really just trying to clarify that these are really, this is intended to be for small change that everyone just agrees with. It's logical, it makes sense, and it's not going to have an impact on your resourcing or anything like that. That's what that little clause there about funding. The provider acknowledges that an amendment will not increase or decrease funding. So if there is an impact on resourcing, funding, that kind of thing, that's a different conversation, and that's the contract variation conversation. Failure to agree, we've put in there that you can use the dispute resolution clause, but really it's just escalating to the next person within DCJ. If you talk to your contract manager and they're not hearing you, that you don't agree to this and you think it's going to have an impact, that you can go to their manager or their manager's manager. That's all that's about. But the intention again is that this will be a conversation before you suddenly get a letter telling you that something needs to be different. It would be in a conversation, and that would be your opportunity to say, this actually sounds to me like it's more significant than just a contract amendment. This sounds like a contract variation. So let's use that process. And then in terms of implementation, the way to get this contract amendment clause into the contract would be to vary your contract to put the new clause in. That's how we would kind of get it in. So then we can use the exercise and option template to amend service delivery in those conditions that I've already described, and following a conversation with the service provider. It's not something that we ever expect would just come out of the blue that would surprise you that we're asking for something to change. So that is the end of my slideshow. I'd like to just ask Anthony if I said anything that you wanted to add to, or if I said anything that you want to respond to.
That's all good. Yeah,
all good.
Yeah, really happy to hear from anybody on the meeting who has questions or queries.
I might just talk to the sector just for a few minutes as well, just talk about from my perspective of talking with organisations and around the conversation that they've had with CPOs as an example. I'm just going to quickly go take back control. Just through. So what I was going to talk about was some examples in particular. So it could be examples I've had with organisations who the reputation of the organisation has increased, and they're having service deliveries are exceeding the contract. So maybe a playgroup or maybe education programs, and the conversations around how will they then use that variation of contract previously would now become the amendment. That's a really clear example. Also looking around in some of the contracts, I've noticed that there's been multiple streams of a certain service type. So you may have community engagement and target and centres and support and targeted intervention, and looking at how you may be able to consolidate those numbers to one total output as opposed to trying to work out which ones are going to be in the different streams. Hello, Felicity, do you have a question?
No, I just wanted to agree with you, Lisa. It's something that I was just checking my notes about whether I missed saying anything, and what you just said reminded me that I think a great way of using the amendment is, as you just described, where, you know, you negotiated your contract and you really wanted to reflect all of the awesome work that you're doing. So you chose to include in your contract lots and lots of service types. But now that we're in the phase of collecting all the data against lots and lots of service types, we definitely know that lots of service providers have gone, ooh, maybe we shouldn't have chosen every single service type where we fit, because now we have to collect heaps of data. And one example that comes to mind for me is like a family support type service where you might have selected information, advice and referral, intake and assessment, family capacity building, parenting programs, counselling, like a whole bunch of things where really you probably could have consolidated a lot of that just into family capacity building, because a lot of the work, information, advice, referral, intake assessment, that all happens within family capacity building. So you could really streamline the number of service types that you've got to make your contract clearer, to make reporting clearer. So that's the kind of thing that we're seeing where we think the contract amendment clause will be useful. Thanks, Lisa.
A really good example too, because within family capacity building, you could be adding things like material aid, counselling, all those other sessions could be combined to that. And I guess another example I've talked to recently is around an agency with staff changes. So they're providing counselling and group sessions with their clients, but the counsellor left, and they're having difficulty in this sector at the moment is around getting staff onboarded. So a staff member that came on board after looking for quite a few months didn't have any group work experience, so they weren't able to meet the contract when it comes to the group numbers, but they were looking at the counselling numbers instead, trying to maybe get increasing those numbers. But again, capacity wise is very difficult for the sector, workforce issues in particular. And I guess just wanted to really quickly take you through some examples of what we might be looking at. So potential case studies, and these are based on real conversations that I've had with organisations in the sector. So an organisation may move premises, which just happened, and they were running a supported playgroup. The new premises, there's no space for that anymore, but they were starting to run more parent-ed classes. So it would be an amendment proposition to change from supported playgroup to parent education discussion with the CPO that could then hopefully trigger that change just through the simple process as opposed to the variation. Does that make sense, everybody? Can I get some thumbs up? And the other one in particular is around information referral and advice that Felicity did mention. You know, you may have said that you're handing out 2,400 real example newsletters to the community, and you're not going to meet those numbers with the data exchange. It's very hard to collect that information, especially as an e-newsletter. It's very hard to actually, it's not part of the contract specs when you do data entry into decks. You can't actually do e-newsletters because you don't know whether someone's actually read that information from that perspective. So the conversation would be maybe a more valuable use of the funds that DCJ does give you is around community engagement. You are doing work in that space already, so you're going to request changing the referral down to 500, and then maybe community engagement is 260. That's a negotiation that you're going to have with your CPO based on your DEX data and your program logic in particular. Talking to that as your evidence, your local based evidence. It's real insight coming from your work that you're doing, and the evidence is now going to be, for you to just have a discussion. And I guess the one where the variation may occur would be if you're working in an organisation, say with young people, you're finding more young people from, say, Indigenous background are coming through into your activities, and it's around, if you do have funding for education and skills, you have 100 clients that you're meant to be working with, but you recognise you probably may want to get a change of variation of contract. There's more intense use of your time and resources when it comes to working with those clients. You may be looking at to transfer to a different stream. So looking at moving from community support to targeted support or intensive support as an option. So does that make sense, everybody? As a quick overview of some really quick examples. What I might do now, we're going to open up to Q&A. Everyone's very excited about that, I'm sure. So again, please pop into the Q&A section of Teams. The question, so we can actually collate it all. I did capture some other conversations in the chat. So I may ask the first question, which is around, someone was saying that, Anthony, when you were speaking about how they've services defining the interaction between DCJ and their contracts. It's from Kylie, if you want to speak to that. She's saying she had a very different experience to that. Actually, I'm going to hand over to Bronte, who's going to be facilitating the Q&A section. So over to you, Bronte, now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bronte and I'm the Project Officer at FAMS. I've just been flicking through these questions as we've been going. There's a bunch in there and a lot of the questions have been sort of under the same realm. So I'll pick as many as we can. I'm just, we only have 15 minutes left, but then anything that isn't answered, I'll make sure that we do pass it on to DCJ, because some of the ones in here, they're not necessarily questions, they're more just comments. So we'll make sure that we pass those on. We had one of the first questions was when you were speaking, Anthony, and you had mentioned about changes to the target of early intervention. I'm just wondering if you could please mention what the changes are, and wondering if it's in addition to the contract amendment clause.
Sorry, changes to by the clause, what the amendment clause applies to?
Yeah, I think there was just confusion on whether that was, you were talking about changes to early intervention, which were in addition to the contract amendment clause.
No, there's no changes to the TEI. The only thing we're really talking about is the amendment clause. But the amendment clause talks about minor changes that a provider might want to make to their contract with DCJ.
And it may be that Anthony was mentioning the change is the implementation of that new contract variation policy. That's the change, and that's why we're here.
Yeah, and that's
why
not,
we've responded.
Yeah, that's not a TEI thing. It's a DCJ.
DCJ.
Yeah, we've been directed to do that. Yeah.
Right, and there's been a lot of mention as well about wondering why there's no leeway to alter the wording of the clause. I think someone else had mentioned, let me just find it. We have no doubt that the current intent is to negotiate with providers. We can't be sure this will be the case moving forward. The language in the clause is problematic and directive, and members have not indicated that they will be, and members have indicated that they will not be signing a contract that includes it.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's part of the challenge we've got with the way that our legal area has framed the clause, and unfortunately they've made it clear to us that there's no option for us to change the language. So I think that the feedback that we're hearing around some of the language in the clause does not reflect the intent with which we want the clause to operate. So I think that's perfectly valid feedback, and yes, at present, as I mentioned at the start, we're going to test the clause with the small number of contracts that have been extended or being extended at the end of June. That's only 15% of contracts. So this is it's not in the 85% of other contracts that end 2025. And if we don't think it works, doesn't add value, if it's not helpful, then we just won't continue with it. If providers at the moment that are entering into or extending their contract don't want the clause in their contract, they can talk to the district and we can just take that clause out of those contracts. That's perfectly fine. As I said, it's kind of, we're interested in testing to see if it works. So, yeah.
Sorry, I have to interject here. This is a contract. It is a legal document. I actually am a little bit concerned about the casualness of saying, oh, we're just going to try and test it in contracts. This is a legally binding document. I'm really absolutely perturbed, and I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to go to another meeting soon. I find this casualisation of a statement around a legal document actually very concerning. And I'm sorry, I had to interject there because, Anthony, you know, I can't keep my mouth shut. But it is very concerning that we're going to just try, test and learn a contract. This isn't a program test. This is actually a legal binding document on both behalves, you know. It's a relationship document. And it's only a minor thing. I'm concerned about clause C. It has no leeway in discussions and negotiation written in a legal sense. I would have liked to have seen the process that was done for the whole human services and changes where services came together. Unfortunately, we don't have Justice Connect to advise us now as services in New South Wales, unless we specifically pay them. And there will be services that will direct that there's some of our funds are used for expenses for legal advice. And I acknowledge it's only 15%. But I'm sorry, I had to interject. This is a legally binding document. It is not a try, test and learn document. Sorry about that, fans, but I just had to say something.
Fair enough.
Okay, if there's nothing more to answer at that one, I might move on.
I just want to say we'll take on board that what you've just said, and we will have further discussions about that situation and trying to resolve that.
Yeah,
It is a
absolutely.
big concern for the sector, and it's totally understandable, and we definitely follow through.
I've got a question here saying, how does DCJ respond to the fact that services were forced to make huge changes in the recontracting in 2020, including a change of location with little or no consultation? We would love to reverse that, but it was written in as a milestone, so probably won't be possible.
Yeah, that was part of the reform phase back in 2020. This doesn't really relate to that. This is kind of the intent of this clause is really about supporting flexibility for providers to make minor changes without having to go through, the formal red tape process of the variation clause. But we take on board the feedback, and like as Margaret said, there's significant concern in the sector around the clause, then we won't be taking it forward. But yeah, look, the reform was 3 years ago now, and that was a whole different kind of process around kind of the changes that were made. So this isn't really a kind of reform initiative. It's really about supporting minor changes and supporting kind of flexibility. But yeah, look, as I said, we're hearing some feedback that the clause might not be useful. That's really valid.
Thanks, Anthony. I also have another question here saying, if we have a number of areas that could be streamlined, is it worth progressing amendments now or waiting until the recommissioning process?
Sorry, can you say that again, Bronte? There was a bit of noise.
Yeah, no worries. If we have a number of areas that could be streamlined, is it worth progressing amendments now or waiting until the recommissioning process?
Look, I'd say it's probably best to do that now. I mean, we've always said to providers, as kind of Felicity kind of reflected on earlier, if there's changes you think you want to make to the contract, you don't need to wait till the end of your contract. You should sit down with the district and have that conversation at any time. It's a kind of principle that we've been talking about since the start of the program, so I'd encourage you to do that sooner rather than later.
Bronte, you're on mute. Bronte,
Sorry,
Bronte, we didn't hear you, sorry.
There we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, sorry everyone. I just have a question here saying, if we are doing less in, say, targeted support, but more in community connections and community centres, how are the number of changes weighted?
Not really sure what that question means.
I think I'm not 100% sure of the intention behind that question either, but if you're wanting to move resources, say funding, from one stream to another stream, that's a contract variation. So I'm not sure what you mean about weighted, but just if you've got more investment in community strengthening right now and you want to move some of that investment and resources to targeted support or vice versa, then that's a contract variation that will need to come, through our program area, so we can also keep an eye on what's happening with the movement of resources in the different program streams, and also your boards will have to sign that off as well.
just a heads up, we've got 5 minutes left on this session. What I'm thinking, I'm talking out of school here, we may have to run another session where it's just basically Q&As, or we'll have conversations another time around this as they start to roll out. So maybe just one more question, Bronte, and then we can wrap up with Susan for the end.
I've just got one more here that I ask. I'm sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but I promise that everything that's in here that wasn't asked will be passed on. I have a question here saying, can we remove some service types to reduce admin burden? And if so, do the total numbers have to remain the same? i.e., if reduces 5 service types to 2, do the total client numbers have to be the same, meaning an increase in numbers for the remaining 2 services?
Look,
Change it. Oh,
any changes to your contract, specifically about your contract, you really need to talk to your district about. I mean, this amendment just talks to a process. It doesn't talk about the actual specifics of the activities you're delivering in your specific contract. So I think that's really a local conversation.
You're on mute.
I'm off mute now. I'm onto it. I just want, I've got one quick question just before we wrap up. I think listening to this conversation, as Lisa said, there's a lot more to it than we originally thought with the intent and in the amount of time that we've got. But just listening to you and Felicity, if an organisation decides not to sign the contract, which you're saying is their right, does that then mean that any change, they would have to have the other, the no option, as in anything you change in your contract has to be a variation? I think we need to be quite clear on the consequence.
That's right. So if this amendment is not in any provider that's entering into a new contract now and doesn't want this clause included, that's fine. You can not have this clause. It just means that any changes that you want to make, regardless of how small, needs to be a formal contract variation.
And I think in closing, this is something that we probably need to go away and have some more thought about, and maybe what FAMS can do is have more of a conversation based on all these questions with DCJ and come back again and try and answer those, just working on those questions and working through some of these case studies so that it's very clear what the consequences are, what is non-negotiable and what is negotiable, and be very clear on that going forwards before we get into trying to put them into contracts. So we'll get on to be doing that together on behalf of the sector if people are happy with that, and make a commitment to come back to you again within probably a month's time and have a session very much based on what the questions are today, the consequences of going forward, not going forward, and what's negotiable and what isn't. Seems like people are very happy with that. I'd like to say thank you to everybody for giving their time today. I've certainly found this really useful. And as I said at the beginning, conversation is so important, because I'm sure what this conversation has done has brought up more things than we actually thought we were going to have to talk about today. And that's our job as a peak, is to advocate on behalf of the sector on things that we believe are important. And I'd like to thank Anthony and Felicity for coming into this conversation and being prepared to now go away and have a rethink, which is what advocacy is all about. So thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. And we will get back to you with a date as soon as we can. And we'll see you at the next conversation.
thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And just one last thing.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.